Who are you? How long have you been with? Oh, and there's our recording. All right, no worries. So, Dave, just for a bit of background from yourself, I guess, what's your background? How long have you been with Red Cross, and how many times around? And why are you here talking with us tonight?
Sure. So my master's is in disaster design and development, so understanding humanitarian management and international development and the link between those two things. Um, I've done a little bit of work overseas in the international development space. When I came back to Australia, I was working in COVID recovery and then bushfire recovery. When I went to Australian Red Cross, I went out to Malakuta for 2 years and worked in the recovery role there, doing recovery and resilience work. And then eventually became the state lead for recovery resilience for a little while as well. Like many people who work with Red Cross, I had a little bit of a break from it and then came back and found myself doing a response role in the Northern Territory for about a year. So that was a lot of on the ground work, hands on work, but mostly around evacuation center management and running IMTs as well, especially around operations. And then only maybe 3 or 4 months ago, returned back to Victoria. So it's really nice to be back. And in this particular role that I'm in now with Red Cross, I'm the specialist for emergency response for Victoria. I sit in the central team with Megan Barry, which most of you will know as well from when she worked in Victoria too.
Excellent, mate. And I think it does speak a lot to the fact that so many Red Cross people do come back into their roles as well. So I think from that, you've got both a huge background of the theory and the academia, but also a lot of experience working in the communities as well. And especially places like Malakuta, I mean, when it comes to examples of community sentiment and challenging recovery journeys, like, you're one of the people who would clearly know what you're talking about in this space.
And
So
I think as well, like
digging,
with the
yeah.
videos that you mentioned as well, like all the documentaries and stuff around Malakuta, if you look closely enough, you'll see the back of my head for a few seconds as well. So I was floating around there too. It's one of the like the work in the recovery space is definitely one of the reasons why I see the importance of community sentiment as well.
Yeah, and I guess to that whole thing, what is your take on the importance of community sentiment? I mean, beyond what we've talked about from your experiences, why is it important?
Well, for I guess a lot of people on this call as well, they'll see what agencies are measuring, they'll see what information is available through a disaster, through an emergency, and a lot of it is around the tangible effects of that event. So how many houses were burnt down? How many houses have been inundated by the flood? Agencies tend to be really good at measuring the numbers of the physical damage and the tangible damage associated with a disaster or an emergency. But we're not really good at understanding the impact that has on people, even though that's why we do emergency management. So if a bridge collapses, it only matters if people miss out on something or being able to do something because that bridge has collapsed. So if that bridge is missing and people can't get to the shops or supplies or leave town, that's what the issue is. And that's why we replace that bridge. So the core part of that community sentiment really is understanding what impact has that event had on the people in that place or the people associated with that place. The other side of it as well is it informs what we need to do to support people through their recovery journey too. So it can be really difficult to understand why one town did really well after the fires and why another town did really poorly, unless we have information that tells us about those communities and about the things that happened to support them or what they did to support themselves as well. And having that information that's comparable is really important. So, was it their social connections? Was it their access to economic opportunities? That story needs to be listened to from the very beginning, and that can come through with community sentiment as well.
I guess that's a really good example of it as well, because we don't have time machines. We don't know what community was like, both in the before, the during, and the immediate after.
Mm.
All we can really rely on is what we have in record. And
Yeah,
so if you're working on this 2 months, 2 years later, how were people feeling during that? That must have a really huge impact on that.
which and the example I've got is when I started the recovery space in Malakuta, it was 1 year after the fires. And so I spent a lot of time reading every single sit rep I could from every agency I could find, including Red Crosses. And having that access to information was so crucial in understanding what we saw was going on in those fires. But what it was lacking still is what the community was going through at the time. So to get that information and to understand how to support people in their recovery journey, it relied really heavily on being in a space where people were willing to tell their story.
Mm. I guess, and given that, we can see where there are cases that, in disasters where we've got some information, but maybe not all, it's been a little bit helpful. Are
Mm.
there any cases where you would say, this is where it's been a really good outcome, where we've seen really good outcome as a result of community sentiment? Or is that something we're
Yeah.
still working towards, do you think?
So we're still working towards being able to do that reliably. But what we have done is in that year I spent in the NT, I was able to bring some of those lessons across from the recovery space and from the response space in Victoria as well, where I was working in the October floods, which is where this recovery considerations documents came from as well. So I was able to combine a little bit of that during some cyclones in the Northern Territory and really change the way that we were collecting information while we were providing BFA so that we were taking notes and then put that into a way of measuring things consistently, like understanding what capitals were affected for people, understanding the common themes that people were experiencing, so that it could come across in a way where it wasn't just recalling conversations that we remembered, it was actual data, it was numbers, it was because there's a huge difference between if 5 people are talking about the kids that they've got in their home having challenges because of a fire versus if it's 5 teachers in that school talking about every child they've got in their class having challenges after a fire. That piece of information, those details, makes a huge difference in understanding what the story is. So in the Northern Territory, we were able to use that kind of thinking in community sentiment reporting, from the data collection to the way we measured it to the way we reported on it and presented it, meant that the information that we collected, the voices of the community, their experiences through the event, through the cyclones, we were able to bundle that up and give it to the control center and say, this is what people are going through, this is what they're saying, this is what we're seeing on the ground as Red Cross, as a neutral party, as a non-government party. And having that information where people say, look, we're still starving. Meanwhile, these agencies are fighting over who's going to pay for food relief. Here's the information to say what the community are going through. And then having that evidence meant that they had to approve it. Like they had the information available to make a valid decision on providing food relief. And they're able to sign the dotted line and make sure that food gets to that community.
Yeah, and I guess it really does make that, you know, it shows the value when you can actually say, if we do not do this, this is why we need to do this, because there is a measurable story, there's a measurable impact to this that we otherwise wouldn't have had in that scenario. Food relief,
Exactly.
well, they should be fine. It's a bit different when there's an entire rack of stories behind that as well, I suppose.
And part of the success of that particular example is we've gathered information that's reliable and has the numbers, has the data, and it's also coming from an agency. Well, it comes from Red Cross, being that neutral, trusted party where people feel comfortable talking to us as well. So it's that combination of how we're collecting the information and how we're particularly in a unique situation where we can transfer that voice, we can be that conduit.
Absolutely. I guess, and I encourage anyone else, if anyone else has questions to David that are jumping into their head, please do sing out. I guess one thing you mentioned before, and this kind of comes into the whole thing around this recovery, is you're mentioning things like the impact within schools, the impact not just psychosocial, but beyond that as well. I guess we do have a slide I can pull up here. We did mention the recovery capitals before. Would you like to talk through just what these recovery capitals mean? Because I'm guessing a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
people might not have
Yep.
heard of these capitals. I will bring up my screen and I will put that on a visual for people as well. All right, this one. Here we go.
Oh, I'm so
All
glad they're all
right.
popping up on the screen as well, and I don't have to try and remember them.
Yeah, no, exactly. All right.
So,
But yeah,
like part of understanding impacts of a disaster, and then part of how we organize agencies to respond to a disaster, falls under 4 pillars in recovery space. So we have the built environment, the economic environment, the social environment, and the national environment. That's how typically we organize ourselves in the recovery space. What we do with our psychosocial lens and our person-centered approach is expand that a little bit to our social capitals. So it allows us to go into a little bit more detail. So we can look at the human capital, which in this case means as human beings, we have a certain level of education, we have certain health requirements. It's about our persons, like our bodies, and what we have, what we're bringing to that environment. So the political environment is how decisions are made. The social environment is how people relate to each other. What are the unspoken rules about how people interact in their community? The cultural environment, again, like it's really similar to that social part of it as well. Like what are the rules around how we engage? What are the rules around how we understand the world around us? What are the rules around how we interact with each other? And you can get a lot of information about that, especially when it comes to psychosocial impacts. So again, like in the NT as an example, a huge piece of information that was missing in a lot of the reporting from different agencies was that cultural capital. What information, what stories are being missed because we don't have that understanding of what the Aboriginal communities are going through as well in that particular example. So how does their cultural lens, or how does their cultural experience affect the way they interact with their environment when it's been damaged? The natural environment is the next step to that as well. So that's how people are surrounded by their environment, how they sit in that, how they experience that. When people move out to a place like Malakuta, they're living there because it's an amazing place full of natural wonders. You've got ocean, you've got lake, you've got mountains, you've got sand dunes, you've got this collection of wildlife that you don't get in a lot of parts of Victoria. And when half of that gets destroyed because of a bushfire, that changes so much. That changes part of your identity. That changes your reason for being there. Financial, really a bit more self-explanatory. That one, your access to wealth, your access to financial means, and then built housing, infrastructure, roads, shops, things like that as well. So being able to go into that level of detail means we have a lot better understanding of what are the things that the community has that are strong and what are the things that the community are lacking. And then when we do an activity, when we provide some kind of intervention in supporting a community, we can really understand what works and what doesn't.
So I guess one way to look at this also would be, even though we might not be dealing with things like the recovery when it comes to damaged roads or economic loss, it is something that people might talk about as a concern. Someone would say, I'm concerned our economy relies a lot on tourism. I'm concerned what this is going to do to our tourism industry, to jobs, etc. That is something we might hear in that case, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, and the recovery capital stuff can get pretty confusing to think about on the ground when we're providing PFA. But when we're providing PFA and listening to people, not only are we identifying the concern they have and the challenge they have in their lives, but if we can go to that next step and understand why that might have happened or what's the cause of that, that's when we can start advocating with government and other agencies around this is what we need to focus on.
Definitely. And I think you hit upon a really interesting point there. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment so people can see everyone else again. One thing that kind of comes up from that, and something you mentioned when you were talking about NT, is that trying to find ways to do this consistently, especially when recovery is a very big domain. What are some ways that Red Cross could do that better? And is there something that you're working on in that space? Like, is there something we're doing to try and do that a bit better?
Yeah, I mean, and Red Cross has been going for a long time in being connected with communities and having those conversations with communities, and we're really well practiced at providing PFA and relating to people, and that's fantastic. What we're kind of like been trying to figure out is how do we do this in a way that's going to be consistent across a whole bunch of disasters in every state and territory, and that's really difficult because every single event is different, every single community is different. So what I've been working on, and this is why the recovery capitals are so important, is understanding what are like the very basic things we can use to understand what's going on, and that's where these capitals come into it. So the idea at the moment on what we're working on is trying to use these recovery capitals as the basis for those measurements. So if we have the same way of measuring something, we can see the change over time. So we can go in a week or a couple of days after the fires and talk to people and get in and understand how we support them and start reporting back. We can go a month later doing an outreach activity and have that same metric system to capture information, and then we can see the trends of how people are improving or how they're needing some more assistance. And then we might get a recovery program going as well 6 months or a year later, and then we can measure that against it too, and we can actually see how that community is doing well or how they might need more support.
That's a good way of putting it. What gets measured gets managed, and having a framework by which to do that consistently and reliably makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Mm.
Awesome. Look, I guess I will throw open the floor if anyone else has any questions for David, if they've got anything in their own experience they think there's something they've thought of from the community sentiment perspective they might like to throw through David's lens of seeing things. Pam, go.